these groups are now really thinking carefully about what is the type of talent that they need to attract to conduct their operations. And ransomware groups are inherently deceiving, right? They need to deceive you to get access to your network and then encrypt it, etc. But on the other hand, they need to gain your trust for you to actually pay them. Lockbit was an organization that operated very much in this outsourcing model, and they were taken down by the UK National Crime Agency and partners. There doesn't seem to be any appetite for the Russian government to collaborate with Western governments to target and arrest some of those individuals that are based there.
Welcome to Underworlds from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. My name is Mark Shaw. In today's episode, I speak to Max Smeets, who's written a book called Ransom War. And Ransom War covers the evolution of the phenomenon of ransomware, which is effectively malicious software which blocks users from accessing their information and their systems. It's effectively a form of extortion. Max explores both the evolution of the phenomenon, he profiles a particular organization and how it has developed, and indeed the internal conflicts within the criminal organization, and he looks at some very interesting ways in which he feels we can respond to the phenomenon of ransomware. Max, welcome to the podcast. It's really a pleasure to have you on. You're making the book this distinction between ransomware and ransom war, and indeed your book is called Ransom War. What do you mean by that? Just as an introduction, the distinction between the two.
I was looking for a term to showcase a qualitative difference between the ransomware activity we saw 5 years ago, or especially 7 years ago, and today. Because today it is remarkably different in a number of ways. First of all, in the way in which these groups are now operating with a very well-defined playbook, going after not just anymore these individuals or your family members or you or me, but going after big corporations and actually managing them to extort them. So we see changes in their modus operandi. But we see also changes in their organizational structure, because these groups are now really thinking carefully about what is the type of talent that they need to attract to conduct their operations, and how are we going to set up our organizational activities in such a way to maximize profit, all the way to the point that some of these entities have 100, 150 people that work for them at a given point in time. And then the third element that is really different from what we saw in the past is the way in which they are developing their own brand and reputation in this space. They have moved away also from just doing what we call single extortion. So this is when you encrypt data, and then you ask for a ransom to decrypt it, towards double or multiple extortion. Double extortion means that you not only encrypt the data, but you also steal it, and you threaten to leak this data online in case an individual doesn't pay. And then multiple forms of extortion would then be to say, hey, if you then still don't pay, we will continue to go after you, or we will continue to go after your clients, or we will have some other form of extortion to hopefully get you to finally pay this relatively large ransom, because the ransoms have gone up from, again, a few $100s to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of US dollars.
The book has the case study of the Conti Group, and I must say it's a great read. There's a mysterious leader, there's quite sophisticated level of organization, there's sort of office politics and fragmentation. Tell us about the Conti Group, its sort of rise and fall, where it is now, what lessons you learned from it in terms of doing the research for the book. I want to come later to how you got some of that information and the challenges of doing research in the area, but just sort of an overview of your key case study.
So Conti was the biggest ransomware group in 2021. By some estimates, it had 80% of the market. And it depends on how you calculate this, whether this is the number of victims or the amount of money that they made. So it was a really significant ransomware group that was primarily operating from Russian-speaking countries. And Conti, as a ransomware group, was quite hierarchically structured. So you had people there that were clearly part of the core team and they would also get a share of the essential profits of this ransomware group. But you also had other individuals that were working on a more permanent or non-permanent basis for this group. You can think of people that were involved in writing phishing emails, or people that were really involved in HR related questions, or people that were involved in more technical endeavors, whether this is creating a specific tool to, for instance, extract data from computer networks or devices. And over time, as they grow and grow and grow, you saw more and more specialized roles coming up, and also questions coming up that indeed would be very similar to any type of business or organizations. Questions on, should we have an office building in St. Petersburg or Moscow? Would that increase the productivity of our employees or not? At the top of this organization is an individual called Stern. This is his persona. And Stern was indeed quite a remarkable individual that clearly was driven with profit in mind, but also thought, you could say, more industry-wide. So at a time when he was developing the ransomware business, he also was thinking about other projects. For example, about the creation of a new social media network, or about the creation of a revival of what we call the carding market. This is a market where cyber criminals steal credit card data and then later on sell it. So he certainly had an entrepreneurial spirit that unfortunately has not been used for a lot of good things.
What has happened to Conti now, Max?
When they were at their prime in 2021, and to some degree, we saw them. There was a lot of internal rife already at the end of 2021 and beginning of 2022. But what really led to their downfall is the leaking of chat messages, internal chat messages. And these were being published or corresponded on over two platforms. One is called Jabber, and the other one is Rocket Chat. So you should sort of see it as WhatsApp and Slack. And the leaking of those chat messages by an individual called Danilo, a pseudonym name, but likely a Ukrainian individual that was disgruntled by all the activity that was going on from Russia against Ukraine during the further invasion. And this person had access to the back end of the server and decided to leak all this data. That was hugely impactful for the organization, as you can imagine, because this data included, what Stern, this leader, said to other individuals, how they would go after targets, but also what, maybe two quite frankly, random operators would say to each other about when they would pick their children up from school or their frustrations with their boss. So a lot of information was made public, and this was highly consequential for the group that ultimately, if it didn't lead to its downfall, it accelerated its downfall.
Max, you have this sort of great insight about trust and ransomware, which comes up at several points in the book. And when you talk about your recommendations, we'll return to it again. But what do you mean in the context of trust? That ransomware groups have to build a degree of trust with their victims, and if they don't, they are less successful?
Yeah, I call it the ransomware trust paradox. It's a paradox because on the one hand, ransomware groups are inherently deceiving, right? They need to deceive you to get access to your network and then encrypt it, etc. But on the other hand, they need to gain your trust for you to actually pay them. And trust here refers to two elements. You need to be seen, or they need to be seen as trustworthy enough that they are capable of actually providing you a decryptor after your data has been encrypted. And that sounds easier than it is. But if you're doing this at great speed, you try to not be discovered, and you're doing this, across a very big enterprise network, that is not an easy thing to do. So you need to trust them that you get that decryptor back, but also that they are reliable enough that they follow through on their promises. That when they say, if you pay, we will not be uploading your data on a leak site. Or if you pay, we will give you this decryptor. If they don't have this level of trust, no one is going to pay them. And so the real question for ransomware groups is not so much, How do they get access to someone's network? Of course, that is important for the defender. But the broader question really here is one, how are they developing this degree of trust? How are they creating this? And they have a number of different tactics that they are deploying to gain this level of trust. They will sometimes showcase their capability. For example, in writing in their ransom note, you can pick any file for free, or you can pick any file and we decrypt it for free. It's a showcase that they're actually able to decrypt. But also, what they frequently do is they point to what is written about them and say, look, there are all these reports in the public domain. And they showcase that we are a fierce group and that we're also very professional, and that if you pay, you actually get your data back. So they're using the public domain to develop that trust and actually make a profit.
Amazing stuff, Max. In another chapter, you talk about, let's call it the geopolitics of ransomware groups. Russia comes up, and that you've mentioned it in relation to Conti. Can you give us a sense, the idea that they were targeting businesses outside of the CIS region, for example, that they had connections to the Russian state in a variety of ways. The chapter gives an indication of all of this stuff. Just talk us through that.
Yeah, when ransomware just emerged, there wasn't this quid pro quo that you as a ransomware group, often operating from Russia, would only target entities outside of Russia or its affiliated partner countries. But that has changed over time. And certainly in recent years, that is the either explicit or tacit agreement, where if you are a Russian-based or largely Russian-based ransomware group, you would never target Russia or its partner countries. And partner countries is not perfectly well defined. Sometimes they also have to figure out which countries, are maybe more controversial to target than others. And these groups, these groups operate often out of Russian-speaking territory and mostly Russia, and they at times have closer links or closer links to the state. In the case of Conti, what we know is that they had to do sometimes what is called pioneering activity, essentially volunteering activity on request of the FSB, where the FSB would reach out often for hard targets to ask for access. And one of the cases was a Bellingcat journalist who was targeted, as this person was helping the Navalny investigations against corrupt activities of the Putin regime. And so you see them occasionally having to do this type of work, and you understand why they will certainly comply with that, because they do not like to be arrested. But equally, you see many of these groups trying to play their hand well and avoid too much of that activity too that they need to do for the FSB, because ultimately that distracts them from focusing on profit-making activities. So you get an interesting relationship there. Now, some of these relationships have changed over time, and the further invasion of Ukraine certainly had an impact. Prior to that, it was even more common to have both Ukrainian individuals and Russian individuals working together. But as I mentioned, you saw this case with this Ukrainian individual, Danilo, that leaked this data from Conti because he or she was disgruntled by Conti's support of the Russian regime. And you can see already sort of a split emerging where, yes, you could still include some of those people within your operations, but you have to be a bit more careful because it might lead to greater insider threats. So we see perhaps more of the nationalization of ransomware in the last few years, and it's unclear how this will develop in the future.
Max, you also have these, drawing on the leaks from Conti, you talk about the organization, as you said, and it's incredible stuff. It's about office space, complaints, some of the stuff you've already mentioned. I mean, did you expect that, this high level of organization as the organization itself evolved? I mean, what do you make of that overall?
I didn't expect it to this extent. And in part because if you would normally read about some of these groups, people will say, yes, they are fears, but and yes, they might be sophisticated in the way in which they hack, but we rarely talk really about their organizational structure. And no, so I didn't quite expect that level of hierarchy. And uh, I do wonder also today to what degree Conti is illustrative of the rest of this space. And I actually do think it's a relatively unique case in that respect too. So what we see more today are not these very hierarchical big groups, but more smaller groups where there is one entity or one group that essentially controls the core of the operation and outsources a lot of the other activity. So what you have with Conti is what we call a much more vertically integrated group that is responsible for the targeting of victims all the way to the payout as well of their Bitcoin. But groups today are operating more in an outsourcing based model where they offer a platform for affiliates or operators to operate from, but then are not involved in selecting all the targets and not involved necessarily in how every individual is getting paid out, and are also not really thinking about how they're going to reinvest this money into other enterprises. So it's will be dangerous to generalize too much from the Conti case. One point to mention in relation to the previous question as well, and its relation to the state, and to this point around office space. What is remarkable is in the discussions about office space, they talk about, will it allow us to be more efficient or not? And can we otherwise, if we do not have this office space, still monitor some of our employees? What they didn't ask in this question is, to what degree does it make us more vulnerable to cooptation by the Russian state? And that is a remarkable sort of lack of finding and lack of anything that I could find on this in the leaks, which might point to, of course, a even closer relationship than I realize.
Max, just before we begin to talk solutions and responses, I mean, how bad are things still in terms of just the numbers of people being victimized? Has the industry peaked? I mean, to some degree, certainly the industry has changed, as you've indicated. But where do we stand now? Is the response to ransomware being one, or are we still far from that?
Since the fall of Conti, we saw a brief reduction in ransomware activity. I think in part because it was such a big player in this space, it required a bit of reformation of groups. You saw people that were part of Conti changing affiliation, creating their own entity, and it took a bit of time. Unfortunately, after that, we saw ransomware again rising to a level that was at least as high as when 2021, if not higher. Since then, we have seen other significant activity that has shaped the ecosystem, not least the fall of a group that became big after that called Lockbit. Lockbit was a organization that operated very much in this outsourcing model that I just mentioned, and they were taken down by the UK National Crime Agency and partners. And since then, you can say, combined with a couple of other events, we have seen a more fragmented ecosystem, an ecosystem with a number of different smaller ransomware groups that are operating and developing their own brand and trying to make a name for this space, which, we are still out whether this is a better thing or a worse thing when it comes to impact. To what degree can these smaller groups still operate efficiently? And as a result of this, will they target more globally? The verdict on that is not out yet. Early indicators of particularly one company called Chainalysis, they do analysis on cryptocurrency payments, seem to suggest that at least in the past year, ransomware payments have gone down a little bit. But we will certainly not know whether this will bounce back very quickly in 2025, because maybe these smaller groups that have fragmented become more mature and learn how to gain more profits.
Max, so you would say overall, it's unclear whether the industry has peaked. It still remains a huge problem for companies and organizations around the world.
Unquestionably. And not least because, you know, there is no sign that the number of targets has saturated. There is still sort of unlimited number of entities that these ransomware groups can hit. You know, when you look at the number of potential victims relative to still the relatively small number of ransomware groups out there, despite the enormous amount of significant consequences, etc., that they have, yeah, the real limit right now is not in the terms of in the victim space, but it's actually in the recruitment space. Can they find the right operators to develop the ransomware and to conduct these operations? And you know, right now there doesn't seem to be any appetite for the Russian government to collaborate with Western governments to target and arrest some of those individuals that are based there. So it doesn't seem, from that perspective, a problem that will go away anytime soon.
Max, it's turning to responses then. The problem is still large, as you say. You outline some successes, and indeed there have been some quite impressive successes, but you also say that there's a lot still to be done. On balance, how would you say we are doing, both sort of commercial industry, state responses, and the like?
Yeah, when I started this book, talking about what I didn't expect, is I didn't expect already so much was done. So I started this and I thought, okay, great. I'm going to talk about, you know, the rise of this group and the standard ransomware ecosystem. Then I'm going to have a very easy chapter at the end where I say governments are not doing enough. They should do more, and they should disrupt more, and they should go after affiliates and sanction them, and et cetera, et cetera. And then I realized, whilst starting this research, I would do a disservice to the current law enforcement community if I would write it in that way, because we have seen a number of different significant initiatives over time that have targeted different aspects of these ransomware operations. For example, law enforcement has gone after the cryptocurrency wallets of specific operators. They've also gone after the cryptocurrency exchanges and tumblers that didn't comply with the national and international rules around this. They have gone after individuals, sanctioned them, occasionally arrested them. They have tried to take down command and control infrastructure used by these ransomware groups, and so on and so on. So we have seen a variety of activities. Now, what is hard is, first of all, for the ecosystem, when they do this type of disruption, to really take them down. Because very frequently, if you just go after one of those elements, very likely this group can reemerge. And this is something that we have seen a lot in the past. Second, law enforcement today has limited resources. So who do they go after? Well, on the whole, they go after the biggest entities, because that is a justification that they can make to, I guess, the taxpayer. That's where we get the biggest bang for buck. And what we have seen with that is an ecosystem where if law enforcement go after the biggest criminal groups, you basically smash one and you see smaller groups mushrooming up, and you go back to this sort of greater fragmentation of the ecosystem where law enforcement has actually maybe played a role in creating that. And that is not necessarily a good thing. And then the third element to lay out here is to go back to what I mentioned, the essence is of the ransomware profit model, which is trust. And what a lot of these activities have focused on in the past is on disrupting their operations, meaning how we can take down this, you know, again, command and control infrastructure, or how they got access to a network. But really in influencing the trust dynamics between these ransomware groups and the victims, we haven't done enough on that. And I believe a lot more can be done.
Max, just speak a bit more about trust, because you suggest things around what, or the ways in which ransomware as an industry should be covered in the media, for example. Do you think journalists covering these issues would be willing to be part of, I don't want to say providing disinformation, but reporting on ransomware groups in a particular way which undermines the trust? I just to understand the point that the book discusses, because it's taking forward your thesis about eroding trust as a response.
Ransomware groups need to develop a degree of trust for them to become profitable and victims are willing to pay. Now, the worst thing that can happen to a ransomware group is that the first 10 search results on Google say that this group, is untrustworthy. It matters what is written in the public, as it can be a real, enabler for them in the negotiations. And that means also that ransomware groups operate differently than often state actors in this space. If you think about, for instance, the Chinese government that has been, conducting a lot of IP theft related activities in cyberspace, they don't want to be called out for that. They rather, once, they are caught, they want to shy away from that public attention. But instead, with ransomware groups, they flourish on this attention because it builds up their reputation and their brand. Once we are aware of that difference between how ransomware groups operate and leverage this public reporting versus state actors, we do then have to think about how we report on them. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't report on them at all, but it means that we have to think more carefully about how we do that in the same way as we do in other domains. So I provide two examples. When we think about terrorism, we are very well aware that terrorists seek to cause terror. And after a terrorist incident, it would actually play into their hand if we report about this in a certain way, which really causes more and more fear in society. And so we have developed guidelines, and journalists are aware about how and when they may or may not report on terrorist activity. Similarly, when we think about disinformation, we often know that when you report, especially in the mainstream media, on a certain disinformation campaign, it might actually exacerbate the level of disinformation that then becomes part of the public discourse. And again, as a result of that, we have really thought about how and when we are going to publish on disinformation. We haven't done that for ransomware yet. So my call is not one we shouldn't publish on ransomware, but we should become much more aware about the impact of public reporting on ransomware activities.
Max, unbelievably interesting debate, I have to say. There's a nuclear option that you mention in the responses, and indeed, as an initiative, we've had that discussion on extortion crimes more broadly in a number of places, and that's to outlaw the paying of ransoms. And there's pros and cons to that in sort of ordinary, let's call it ordinary extortion. Just outline what you think the pros and cons are in relation to cyber extortion of the type that you've been studying.
Yeah, it's a very important proposal to consider alongside many of these other initiatives that I mentioned. And we see this proposal most explicitly now being discussed in the UK. There are a couple of dimensions here. First of all, let's say a country like the UK would ban ransom payments. I'm not sure if it will really impact the ransomware ecosystem as a whole, but perhaps, and this implicitly is the hope, I think, of the UK government, perhaps it might shift some attention away from the UK towards other countries, right? So it is a bit of a question here of what are you addressing? Are you addressing really the core problem? Or are you trying to shift away attention towards, hey, maybe go to our neighbor, across the canal, maybe there you can target some. So that's one element. The second is a bigger question around should we create certain exceptions around ransom payments if the human costs are too significant of not paying? You can imagine cases where the disruption is so severe and the consequences could be so significant that you might be forced into paying, might be a public health crisis around hospital networks, or you name it. And so you think about a sort of licensing model or an exception model that allows still for those payments to be made. And on that model in particular, I am very skeptical because I believe it will actually create a target set for ransom groups, right? The moment you create this opportunity of a license or of exceptions, it is exactly those entities that then become most interesting to target for ransomware entities. So I'm not very much in favor of that. Now, there is one other element that I didn't really discuss in great detail in the book, but it remains also worth considering. It's a question on, should outright payment not be allowed, i.e., whatever type of ransom is asked, you're not allowed to pay, or are you not allowed to pay for certain types of uh, digital extortion? So, for example, you are allowed to pay to get your data decrypted, and you're not allowed to pay to have your data leaked, to not have your data leaked online. We've seen these proposals and legislations already being discussed in a couple of countries and partially implemented. It's an interesting one as well. I do not really firmly believe that that is extremely helpful because at times it is hard to delineate these different sets of activities.
Max, you have talked about, at different places in the book, about the challenges of doing research in the area. Conti, as you've described, is this huge data dump, which you've clearly gone through in a great deal of detail. We would never have had the insights that we've had if that hadn't occurred, I assume. I mean, what are the general challenges for the research community of looking at the ransomware problem? How much is available? Where are the innovations? What more innovation, if you like, can we expect in this space?
Yeah, so in my book, I look at ransomware actually across 3 dimensions. And I call this the MOP framework: modus operandi, organizational structure, and branding and reputation. To understand ransomware groups as a whole, you need to understand their modus operandi, more how do they really do these operations. And for that, you need a bit more technical data, right? You need to look at how they got access to a network, how they leverage this access, et cetera, et cetera. And that is available often in the public domain. There are a lot of private sector companies that write what we call threat intel reports on these groups, and that can help you to sort of dissect how these groups operate. The second of the MOP is organizational structure. That is extremely challenging to study, but in my case, luckily with the Conti leaks, I had that opportunity because I could really look at who were these individuals that were talking to each other and what were their motivations. This is something that we had for Conti. We don't have it for every group. That said, there are a number of other leaks that have taken place in the past few years that would allow for a similar analysis. And I really hope that someone picks up on that. We've seen other groups like what is called a group called Yang Liwang or Black Basta, where we've also seen leaks of this kind that would help to uncover a similar story. And then you think about branding and reputation. This is a lot about them communicating to the public. What's interesting about that is that it's in the public. One can analyze their leak sites. One can analyze how they write their ransom note. And sometimes we can analyze even how they are engaging with victims. And so I do think it's hard to study all the 3 pillars for a single case, but across the 3 pillars, you can rely on different types of data to elucidate how these groups operate. Where I see one of the fields, or where I see a lot of interesting research questions going, is in relation to how affiliates or operators of these ransomware groups actually negotiate with victims. And I've been very lucky now to work together with the UK NCA, National Crime Agency, to start uncovering some of that based on the material that they obtained as part of this operation to take down Lockbit called Operation Kronos. And hopefully in a year or so, I can present those results as well.
Max, earlier in the book, you talk about, I guess it's a small number of people who are doing these negotiations regularly. They seem to have trust or at least connections with the ransom groups. Are they are they a sector that can be talked to or interviewed? Do you know of any of that, or do you think are these guys really blocked off from people doing research in the area?
No, absolutely. They are very open to, or not all of them, but some of the best organizations in that space are very open to engagement with researchers and attend workshops. There is a researcher at RUSI, Jamie McCall, who's already done a study on these intermediaries and assess their role. And indeed, their role is important because they sometimes they will engage with certain ransomware groups on a repeated basis. They have negotiated with this ransomware group for one victim, and then they renegotiate for another victim as well. So they can pick up on certain patterns. There is then, of course, a question to what degree they might be enabling this industry if they advise towards payment or non-payment. And the second important intermediary here is the insurance industry that can play a role in setting essentially a benchmark or a ceiling for ransom payments. And people have questions to what degree this is a positive or negative development, because again, that might enable people to simply pay and feed back into the ransomware ecosystem.
Max, the book is published this year, so it's 2025. You make this very interesting comment in the conclusion that when you began, which I guess is a few years ago, or writing up perhaps in the last year, that there was very little scholarly work in this area. Why do you think that's the case? Is it because it's moving too rapidly for academics or researchers to keep up, or is it a data question? Why is the literature still so small, and do you expect it to grow?
I think it comes particularly for scholars with my background, originally international relations trained scholars. It comes with, I think, a more general bias. It's like, when we think about these big questions on international and national security, we tend to draw to on analyzing state activity. What is China doing? What is Russia doing? And the first question that I was asked when I started this project is, it sounds interesting, but what is the link to the state? And I had to say, well, there are interesting nuanced links to the state, but these groups in and of itself are really impactful and can have real consequences to national security and deserve to be studied. And so I think there is a broader bias in this in the scholarly literature that has fed into this subdomain of cybercrime as well. But the second one is one around the availability of data. I think there is now a growing awareness that data is available, but I think 3-4 years ago, that awareness wasn't there as much. So that's the second one. And third is the one that you mentioned. The field has dramatically changed. 5 years ago, we didn't see that level of activity that we see today. It's a space that has evolved very quickly in its targeting and in the way in which it is holding national security at risk. And again, it's really an open question of how this will develop in the future.
Maxine, you clearly know the field and the people working in it from a research side. Where do you think research should be looking? What issues are uncovered or not well covered going forward?
Yeah, one that I mentioned is around victim and affiliates. So really understanding those dynamics. The second is a question on maturity. So what does it really mean to talk about mature ransomware groups? And what are the different models that are really out there today? We don't really have a good framework for that. And I am in many ways waiting for someone to develop that. Alongside that, there are still a lot of relevant research questions around the impact of different forms of disruption. To what degree is it more impactful to go after, let's say, Bitcoin wallets versus their more technical infrastructure? How long do these groups remain down after you have disrupted them? These questions are still not very well addressed. And last, I think there is a question here around the ecosystem. Yes, it's a growing ecosystem, but equally there seems to be the case that a number of core individuals constantly pop back up in different groups. And the tracking of those individuals will be extremely valuable. And that sounds like a impossible task to do, and it's certainly not an easy one. But considering the more recent releases of government material on specific individuals that were part of these groups, as well as data from, for instance, cryptocurrency analytic companies that can track Bitcoin wallets over time, more can be done in this space that hasn't been done so. And what it would showcase is essentially a much better understanding of the evolution of this space that goes beyond just the brands that are out there of these different ransomware groups, but really who's behind it. So there's more than enough still to be done, that's for sure.
So it's a research-rich environment here, Max, where you are working.
Yes.
Max Smeets, thank you very much. That's the book. Ransom War it is called. It's really an excellent overview of the history of the debate and how and of the industry, as well as looking at solutions. And as you've heard from Max, looking at some of the research questions, really pertinent, important, I think, for public research partnerships, Max, as you've alluded to. A very big thank you for coming and talking about the book.
Mark, thank you for having me.